All right. So, for our first topic, this week's deep dive, we are going to talk about the Founders and Acquired podcast and a session that these three did together. So, just to give you a quick breakdown on these entrepreneurs, the Acquired podcast is created by Ben Gilbert and David Rosenthal. They're the co creators of the podcast. They dive into in depth stories of some of the most iconic companies in the world. And their listening base is some of the most successful entrepreneurs, founders, and business people around the world. So, Ben Gilbert is an entrepreneur and venture capitalist, co founder of Pioneer Square Labs, a startup studio and venture fund based in Seattle. David Rosenthal, a former venture capitalist at Madrona Venture Group. He comes with a deep understanding of finance, business, and strategy. Together, these two combine their expertise to provide thoughtful commentary on company building. Their podcast has gained recognition among top tier entrepreneurs and investors, including meetings with prominent figures like Mark Andreessen and Bill Gurley. And then we have the creator of the Founders podcast, that is David Senra. He's the creator and host, also the one man shop, does all the editing and work on Founders still today. And this podcast basically explores the lives and lessons of history's most influential entrepreneurs and creators. So, David always had a love of reading. Since he was young, he was reading like crazy. He would go to the library and just read books. Had a Cuban immigrant father who taught him to never half ass anything and to work hard. And one day he told his friend, I want to make a business out of how much I read. And so that was the start of the Founders podcast, and also one of the most impressive podcasts out there for really deep dives on business and business topics. And how do you know this? David had a meeting with Charlie Munger where he talked about Charlie's life and lessons. And also, obviously, Charlie had that meeting for a reason. He also had a meeting with Sam Zell, one of the biggest real estate icons in the world, where he was able to pick his brain and share wisdom. So obviously, both of these podcasts have been incredibly influential to some of the greatest entrepreneurs and business minds around the world. And in the session that they did, we get some insights into how they think about making their podcast and what goes into making a product that so many influential business people want to study. Yeah. I don't know if you had any thoughts, Emmanuel, that you want to kick this off with as well.
Mm, No particular insights, but the only thing that I found quite interesting or what I like the most is that they just cover many different topics within the business land and shed light to certain topics in entrepreneurship, as you mentioned. And I think it's a really great way to learn and just benchmark for aspiring entrepreneurs as well as founders who are currently running startups. So I think it's just really great content.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan of both of these podcasts. I listen to them all the time, finding episodes that I want to listen to, new episodes, going back in their catalog and listening, getting book ideas as well. Really awesome content. So I broke this up into two main categories. First, I have general lessons from the pod, and then I have more lessons about the podcasters and their craft of podcasting. So, specifically, a bit about their story and how they make great podcasts. So, I'll go and read you through some of my top insights, starting out with general business and life lessons from the podcast. And this is very much a discussion, Emmanuel. So, feel free to chime in how your reaction to any of these insights. So, this was a quote from the podcast. Within 2 years of intense study, you will get to the point where you know more about what you are studying than anyone else. You don't meet founders who are into entrepreneurship, it's their lives. This really rang true to me. And I think it's also inspiring in terms of what you can do and what you can learn. You look at when Elon Musk was in his early days of SpaceX, everyone was laughing at him, saying he was never going to be able to do it. And the reality is, with a couple of years of intense study for more complex industries, maybe 5 or 10, you can really be one of the leading experts in the world. So the only limits are what you put on yourself. Another interesting insight, Charlie Munger said he made 450 million reading Barron's every year. He read Barron's for 50 years, found one investment from reading Barron's, made $50 million off of it, and then gave that money to Li Lu and turned it into $450 million. So I think this was an interesting lesson on the concept of leverage. And leverage is a lesson that we get exposed to again and again when we study history's greatest entrepreneurs. David Senra actually said this in the podcast, the creator of the Founders Podcast. Learning from history is a form of leverage. Again, as I said, leverage is super important. And learning from history and what he does, studying history's greatest entrepreneurs, is a form of leverage. Naval Ravikant constantly talks about finding leverage, whether that's content, code, labor being one of the most historic forms of leverage. And David highlights here that this learning he does, studying all these entrepreneurs, he's gaining insights from their whole career and piecing them together into his understanding and approach to how he lives life. So David is also a huge fan of history's greatest entrepreneurs and greatest business minds. And he had this also to say about Steve Jobs. Believe it or not, Steve Jobs was also a huge fan of entrepreneurs before him, as many of history's greatest entrepreneurs have been. They idolize previous entrepreneurs. They study them, learn from them. There's no Jeff Bezos without Sam Walton. There's no Steve Jobs, in this case, without Edwin Land. And so when Steve Jobs visited Edwin Land in his 20s, he said, visiting Edwin Land was like visiting a shrine. And Edwin Land was this incredible entrepreneur who really redefined the way that optics was done. He was an incredible mind and one of the geniuses of his time. And also one of these entrepreneurs who really had no limits. He decided he was going to solve something, and he did. There's so much more you could say about Edwin Land in other episodes, but I thought it was really telling to just hear how much Steve Jobs idolized him. And let me see if I can think of what he said. Steve Jobs, I believe this was the quote. He said, "We are building at the intersection of liberal arts and technology," something along those lines. And that was one of his famous lines at a keynote. And that was just a ripoff from Edwin Land. So you see this again and again through history, where the great entrepreneurs are taking lessons from entrepreneurs before them, using what works, throwing away what doesn't. In this episode, they talk about how today you can find very intellectual content online through podcasts. Before, books were really the only way to do this. And this is a really interesting change that we see in the world now. Everything is moving digital. We have podcasts where people are distilling and refining this knowledge so that you can get the knowledge from a book that would take you hours and hours to read in 1, 3, 4 hours or so. Another takeaway that I noticed here is all three of these creators in this episode, really, you can feel the passion that they have for what they're doing and the desire to deliver at the highest level. This is something also from reading books like Becoming Steve Jobs or Steve Jobs by Walter Isaacson. You realize that he holds his team to such a high standard, and it's almost constantly rejecting, and this isn't good enough, go back. It's almost as if the greatest creators and entrepreneurs just have a higher standard for what they expect and are willing to rewrite, rebuild, and keep working on it until it hits that standard. So that was a really interesting insight, and something that through various things that all three of these guys said during this podcast, you could tell they felt a lot of pressure. The average acquired podcast has a football stadium full of people listening to it in the first few days. And it's not just football fans, it's some of the top entrepreneurs and CEOs around the world. So these guys feel a ton of pressure to deliver the absolute best product to their end listener. And that's something that I really want to take away. I think an incredible lesson to just really push for a higher and higher standard, and imagine some of the top entrepreneurs around the world listening to your content. And is it living up to what they expect and being useful for them, giving them insights that will make them better at their craft?
It's quite interesting also. When we look at digital media, we see things such as 40 views or 40 listeners when we see the analytics on podcasts. But actually to imagine, like 40 might not sound as much, but 40 people, a room for 40 people is quite a lot if you can actually visualize. Now imagine, just as you said,
Yes.
the football stadium, like of people, of entrepreneurs, people who are planning to run a startup, people are running startups, people are running multi-million dollar businesses. It becomes a little bit surreal when you think of such large quantity. Really interesting when you put in this type of mindset, working on something that you love that much.
Yeah, and you can use it in a healthy way to increase the pressure for quality, right? Like it's the thing about online media is it's easy to throw crap out there and not care about it. But you're not going to go in front of 40 people and just do a really crappy presentation, right? So if you add that perspective, it increases the pressure on you to really deliver an excellent product and something you can be proud of. So I thought that was an awesome insight. This ties in. So another quote they brought up from Steve Jobs: the older I get, the more I realize why people choose to do things matters. And this kind of goes into like other quotes by Charlie Munger: follow your natural drift. I'll have to find it a little further down here, but Charlie Munger also said something along the lines of most of the problem when you're not doing a good enough job is you're just not passionate enough about the industry or the problem. So, Steve Jobs: the older I get, the more I realize why people choose to do things matters. It's because if you really want to be great, you have to love what you're doing. It has to be something you're passionate about doing. Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger don't do their annual shareholders meeting. Charlie Munger, obviously, rest in peace. They didn't do that for all those years because it was a business requirement or because it was nice. It was that they really loved to get out there and talk with their shareholders and present and talk about business and investing. And that's why they were so good at it. And people don't think of Warren Buffett and Berkshire as a media company. But another interesting insight I had: everyone knows about Warren Buffett's shareholder letters. He's taught so much of the world about investing. And obviously that helped his deal flow. People reach out to him if their business is in Wall Street, reaches out to Warren Buffett if Goldman Sachs is about to go bankrupt. He has incredible deal flow from that media and from that brand. So, yeah, some really interesting concepts there on why you need to be passionate about what you do. And take a few days, think about this as you're walking around. Is what you're doing and what you want to do something that you have fun in the practice? This was another interesting insight from this podcast: is the greatest entrepreneurs and creators, performers in all industries, the practice is fun to them. When they're alone at the end of the day watching game film, they enjoy that tedious improvement, looking at what they can do better. And if you're not in an industry where you enjoy the practice, good luck at being in the top percent of that industry.
But I also feel like that's something that gets lost quite often as well. People say they want to reach that top percent or top 5% or 1%, but I think many people don't also realize how much fun it actually is to be striving for that work, the actual actions that go into it. And sometimes that gets forgotten. And I think sometimes reminding oneself that it's the actual process that matters and what's actually fun. I don't know, it brings back the whole entrepreneurial spirit again. It's
Exactly. That's why we're doing this. I have a passion about studying entrepreneurship and technology. And that passion and desire to improve, I could care less if this doesn't improve for 3 years. It's fun and I'm learning a lot and I enjoy the practice. So I really think that's such a key. And that's something David Senra talks about as well. I wish I had this quote, but it was something along the lines like, time is the greatest leverage, or I'm not getting that, but essentially the power of time, where if you have staying power, if you have endurance, you're going to get better. If you get those reps in, you're going to get better. And if you love something, you're going to do it just because you love it. And by that, you're going to get better. Your true self is going to shine through. You're going to find your authentic way of communicating in the sense of a podcast or doing business or performing a sport. And so I thought that was really interesting. Another interesting concept. This was from a top banker, forgetting his name, but another David Senra quote, who he's like a dictionary of the best quotes from top entrepreneurs and business people. One thing I know for sure, to make money and to get rich is to play games where you have an edge. So you always want to make sure you have an edge. You're combining all these lessons from studying history, studying your competition, but you also need to figure out what your edge is and how you can stand out. Jeff Bezos was asked many times, why don't you go into physical retail? And Jeff Bezos said, physical retail is an ancient business. I am not going to go into that until I know I have a significant advantage. It is hard to win in ancient businesses. This was really interesting and ties really well into that quote. He didn't feel he had an edge there. They might have the biggest online retailer, but physical retail is an industry that has been around. It's ancient, and so many tricks of the trade have been refined, and the profit margins have come down so much because of the competition in such an ancient industry. When you look at newer industries, newer markets, you typically have more opportunity and more profit margin because that competition hasn't worn that down and made it more competitive and harder to compete. So even Jeff Bezos, very slow. Even today, it's more concept stores that Amazon has than anything. They're not going all in on physical retail. And that's because they don't feel they have an edge there. And so that was a really interesting insight. I thought just always making sure you have an edge kind of on that topic. Something that I thought was very interesting that these three guys, I think it was Ben Gilbert who said this, that the dirty secret of the Acquired and Founders podcast is that people don't read books. And if you can just read books and distill their knowledge into a podcast, you can get 10x the market of the book because people won't read that book, but they'll listen to a podcast for an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours about that book and the top insights. So you're basically leveraging this incredible research of these authors and historians and putting it in a digital media form where you're going to be able to 10x the viewers of that content if you do it successfully. That was a super powerful insight that I think we can study as we're trying to make content, but also just showing that they found an edge and they found a power law and some leverage that they could take advantage of in what they were doing. Yeah, Edwin Land also on this topic, another quote. I have a personal motto. Don't do anything that anyone else can do. I mean, straight to the point, keep it simple. Let's see what else we got here. I think maybe just one last thing I want to highlight here. And just one final note that I thought was really interesting from David Senra, less related to content, but more related to business in general. Lowest cost structure is the largest theme in the history of entrepreneurship. So if you look at Sam Walton, if you look at Jeff Bezos, if you look at LVMH, if you look at all these entrepreneurs, one of the biggest things that they try to do is keep an efficient and low cost structure. And that, to David Senra, who's one of the best historians in modern days on entrepreneurship and business, that is the largest theme and the main form of leverage history of entrepreneurship. Super interesting. All right, so let's switch gears and let's talk about some of the insights specifically related to podcasting and the story of how these guys created the Acquired podcast, how they created the Founders podcast, a little bit of their backstory. So, as I said before, these guys are relentlessly obsessed with making sure each of their episodes steps up the bar and lives up to the expectation of their audience. They want to be embarrassed by their previous episode because they improve so much in the next episode. The reason that David Senra took the jump to actually go all in on founders was reading an essay by Paul Graham, How to Do What You Love. A little teaser, we'll cover that in next week's podcast, something I've read several times. All of Paul Graham's blog is an incredible resource on entrepreneurship and doing great work. He actually read that essay one night, and that is what convinced him to go all in on making a business out of founders and sticking it out no matter how long it took. And there was many years where he was working on founders, trying to figure out the business model before it became the breakout success that it is today. So this is a little bit more on the founding of Founders Podcast. How did you decide to dedicate your life to this? And David Senra said, I've only had one habit as long as I can remember. That is reading. How can I make a career out of my reading? He also studied anti-patterns. So this is funny. David Senra had a rough upbringing. So Charlie Munger talks a lot about this too. Look at what people do and learn what not to do as well as what to do. And so David Senra was on a panel and they asked him, what did you learn from your upbringing? And he said, don't do cocaine and graduate high school, which was hilarious. Basically seeing some of the people doing stupid shit in his life, and let's not do that. Let's actually get our shit together and not do drugs and actually graduate high school and do something significant. So these were anti-models that he followed. Really interesting stuff. And I can definitely relate to that myself from my upbringing. Seeing David Senra really always felt like he was the adult among adults when he was younger. And I can definitely relate to that. Seeing a lot of alcoholism and drug use when I was younger and realizing this is not the way to live an epic life and to do great things. And his mom actually trusted him more than any of his other family members. So I could be getting this wrong, but I think it was her will or something who was going to be the trustee. And rather than trusting any of the older members of the family, it was actually David Senra who was going to be in charge because he was simply more mature than the others. So he had much more freedom growing up because his mom said, you're smart, you're going to make good decisions. So yeah, you can do whatever you want. And that was really interesting. And he turned his passion for reading into a business through a challenging upbringing, it sounds like. Another interesting insight I got from David Senra is he actually goes back and listens to his podcasts as references. If he is going to do a new episode on Edwin Land, he might go back and listen to his previous episodes. And this is interesting because it's another concept like build for yourself. So a lot of times Steve Jobs was building products that he wanted. And this kind of applies to podcasting too. It's do a podcast, do content that is actually valuable to you, where you go back and you listen to it as a reference. That's a really good signal that other people are going to find it interesting. Trying to rip through these, but I got a long list here. Another tactic that I grabbed from the guys talking here, this was a lesson from David Ogilvy. And you're not advertising to a standing army. You're advertising to a moving parade. Previously in the Acquired podcast, I believe it was their Sequoia episode was one of their best episodes. And David Senra encouraged them to re-release that episode. Lots of their new listeners hadn't heard that previous piece of content that was so excellent. So you're not advertising, your content isn't going out to a standing army. Your content, your media is going out to a moving parade of new people. Your best content, you can re-release it to showcase to your newest audience members some of the awesome work that you've done. Another concept on David Ogilvy that I thought was really interesting. So I actually had this experience telling someone I was reading David Ogilvy's book, and he's an advertiser. And this person was like, oh, advertising, that's just a scam or whatever. Said that David Ogilvy was a genius. He said, you need to study David Ogilvy. And Warren Buffett has met some of the best business people in the world. So if he says that about David, then I think you need to take it very seriously. And so going and studying the lessons that he has. And something David Senra did at the end of David Ogilvy's book on advertising, he talks about the 6 people who influenced his thinking on advertising. And David Senra, of course, what do? It's simple. If David Ogilvy learned from these 6 people, let's go read about all these 6 people and study the lessons that they teach and that they learned in their career. It really comes down to your craft, refining your craft and studying the greats, studying who they studied, who they admired. There's really some simple logic that you can follow and be disciplined to become one of the best in your industry. Many top advertising people have not read David Ogilvy. And if you're not doing that, how are you going to be the best if you haven't studied the best in the world? So, really powerful concept, in my opinion. So then the guys go on to discuss a little bit about this, like learning from the greats. So David Rosenthal said, great entrepreneurs stand on the shoulders of giants. They come up with at least 1 to 2 novel ideas. David Senra said, yeah, it's the combination of these ideas. And then Ben Gilbert said, it is one big novel idea with the combined concepts of others. So you can see this all. It's not just the ideas from history. It's also either a combination of those that is unique or a new novel approach combined together. But if as you study the greats in whatever industry you're in, you're going to start to form your own novel ideas of how this can apply to the environment today. Another really powerful concept. Yeah, David Senra, everything in life is a repetition. I covered this before, but the power of time and just endurance, sticking with something. I think one definition I read of endurance that I thought was so epic was like to suffer eloquently or something. Oh, I gotta find this. I get this one right. Yeah, so one of my favorite definitions of endurance is to suffer honorably. You embrace that suffering and you do it righteously, you do it honorably. And endurance is one of the greatest powers for entrepreneurs and creators, without a doubt. Another insight on podcasting. So both acquired and founders go through line by line of their podcast and they cut out the fluff. They cut out the blank spaces. They cut out sentences that don't make sense. They refine their product and make sure what they're releasing to their audience is something that they can be incredibly proud of and that delivers the most valuable information in the most concise and effective form. Both of them said, can I listen to our podcast and enjoy it or reference it? That's the true test of if it's going to be evergreen content that you're going to go back to and that your audience is going to go back to. Is it only interesting that week because of that story, or is there something about it that really stands out and makes it have staying power? Yeah, so those were some of the top insights from this acquired sessions with David Senra, and just power packed with great information, quotes from history's greatest entrepreneurs. Both of these podcasts are incredible and something I listen to every single week. So hopefully you got a few tidbits of knowledge and can check these out yourself and start to study some history's greatest entrepreneurs and business stories.